Good evening. My name is Katie Ingham, and I'm a junior biochemistry major here at Hillsdale College. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. Darel E. Paul is a professor of political science at Williams College, where he has taught since 2001. A native of Minnesota, he earned his BA and PhD from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. He is a regular contributor to First Things and has written for numerous other publications, including The American Mind, Quillette, and Arrow magazine. He has also written for academic journals on class politics in Western countries and the manifestation of elite ideologies in public policies. He is the author or co-author of 3 books, including The Theoretical Evolution of International Political Economy and From Toleration to Equality, How Elites Brought America to Same-Sex Marriage. Please join me in welcoming Darel E. Paul.
Good evening. As Katie mentioned to you all a moment ago, I'm a professor on the faculty of Williams College. And according to U.S. News and World Report and Forbes and the Wall Street Journal, not Washington Monthly, but we don't care what they think, Williams is supposedly the #1 liberal arts college in America. And one would expect then that Williams, being the #1 liberal arts college in America, one would expect then that when Williams most recently went through its accreditation process, it went through it most recently 4 years ago, those accreditors would be duly impressed with the institution's clear definition of and commitment to the liberal arts. Alas, this was not the case. I quote from their report, quote, "We observed that Williams faculty, staff, administrative leaders, and students expressed little consensus about what the liberal arts is and does, what it represents on their campus, how their approach intervenes in the national discussion of the liberal arts model, opportunities for developing a contemporary delivery of the liberal arts, and what leadership in this sector might comprise. Consistent with the highly decentralized model of governance at Williams, some faculty members asserted that each department and program develops and implements its own vision of the liberal arts, an assertion that sits uneasily alongside the claim to the combined power of depth and breadth, and of initiatives that cut across the disciplines and administrative divisions. More than one professor responded to the question about the liberal arts with the quip, 'We know it when we see it.' Given the prominence of Williams as a top-ranked liberal arts institution, the team was struck by the absence of a sharp articulation of a forward-looking liberal arts mission distinctive to Williams, both in the institution's mission statement and across dozens of conversations we conducted during our time on campus," unquote. Now, I don't mean to pick on my employer by bringing this up. I offer it instead as a way of suggesting that if the supposedly #1 liberal arts college in America does not know what the liberal arts are or what the mission of a liberal arts college should be, we shouldn't be at all surprised if American higher education more broadly is just as confused. As you've already indulged me in one Williams story, I hope you'll be patient with a second. Williams College was founded in 1793. At its bicentennial celebration about 30 years ago, the institution's eminent historian, Fred Rudolph, gave an address marking out 3 eras through which not only Williams, but in the view of Rudolph, all elite higher education institutions in America had passed through up to that time. The first, he said, was what he called the Christian College. From the colonial period up to really the late 19th century, the Christian college was characterized by a single classical curriculum centered on ancient languages, and in fact, being able to pass an entrance exam in Latin and or Greek was really kind of a marker of that emphasis on a classical education, as well as mathematics, logic, literature, the physical sciences. There was, of course, in the Christian college mandatory chapel attendance to cultivate a Christian spirit. The faculty was small and primarily composed of generalists rather than specialists. The student body, certainly at Williams, was very much a local one. And in fact, in Rudolph's quote, he says that Williams at that time was made up of, in his words, poor boys of Calvinist upbringing who could not afford to go to Yale. There was also a code of conduct at what Rudolph called the Christian college, encouraging deference to authority and the curbing of eccentric or nonconformist behavior. By the late 19th century, all this had transformed into the second era, what Rudolph called the gentleman's college. What characterized the gentleman's college? Things like a loosening of the strictures of a classical curriculum piece by piece. In fact, at Williams at least, the Latin requirement was abolished for the class of 1938. No one need any longer complete Latin to graduate from the institution. The student body went from being a much local one, right, the poor boys who couldn't afford to go to Yale, to a more regional student body throughout the Northeast and the Midwest. In an era of mass primary and increasingly mass high school education, the gentleman's student body cultivated by receiving students from college prep schools at various parts of those regions in the country. It was also characterized by the cultivation of what we might call gentlemanly values, especially through fraternities and athletic teams, as well as a sense of personal honor and a deference to hierarchy. And finally, the growing support staff of the gentleman's college was characteristic, and an increasingly large bureaucracy befitting, one might say, a gentleman's club. In the wake of World War II, Rudolph observed the emergence of what he called the consumer college, opening colleges and universities to the masses after World War II and catering to their interests in civic and professional advancement, much more so than, we might say, a cultivation of their characters. By this time, by the 1940s and 1950s, we have entered into a period of universal high school education. So therefore, the students who might go on to college were looking for an experience much more similar to their high schools than certainly private schools like Williams were offering until that time. At Williams, at least, mandatory chapel ended in the 1950s, and fraternities were eliminated at Williams in 1961, which I would say are the two, in rapid succession, symbolic deaths, if you will, of both the Christian and the gentleman's college. The college goes co-ed in about 1970, as many schools did in the United States, private ones in particular. Increasingly, liberal, or one might choose the word libertine environment began to be predominant. There's an old joke characteristic of the consumer college that the job of a college president is to provide sex for the students, a winning football team for the alums, and parking for the faculty. Williams also became, as most elite institutions of higher education at this time became, a national institution, and in Rudolph's terms, a, quote, national institution going global. And as well, it was a response to market forces. The growth of increasingly lavish facilities, larger and larger bureaucracies providing services of all sorts, the end of really what could be called any kind of coherent curriculum in terms of, to be replaced with a essentially do-it-yourself education. One element of Rudolph's take on the consumer college, though, in my view, is overly naive. What Rudolph thought the consumer college of the post-World War II period was about was, in his words, this is a quote from his work, a fulfillment of the democratic promise of America. Or elsewhere he talks about the democratic, tolerant, and diverse culture that characterizes the consumer college. In fact, in his speech at the 200th anniversary of Williams College in the early 1990s, he cites Tocqueville himself to defend this view. But rather than a great democratic wave washing over the elitist world of the gentleman's college, I think the consumer college is better thought of as the meritocratic college. This is the college we're all familiar with today, one in which excellent performance on the SAT, or a wealth of advanced placement courses, or a long resume probably accumulated since middle school, demonstrating one's capacity for leadership, is the price of admissions. My point in walking through this history is twofold. The first is to demonstrate that the mission and even the definition of the liberal arts has changed markedly over the last 200 plus years. Who is to be served? The ideal of character to be formed, the institutional embodiment of learning. Each has transformed higher education and what we take to be the liberal arts. The second is to suggest that America may be on the cusp of a fourth era, a post-meritocratic one, defined by a new curriculum, new standards of achievement, a new ideal of character, and a new social purpose, generally going under the name, at least certainly at Williams, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or more succinctly, social justice. Fred Rudolph, the Williams historian that I've been quoting, his sketch of higher education is really a small part of a much larger tale of the evolution of the American elite. Higher education today tends to be rather shy about this role that it serves in our society. That is, to admit that its mission is to cultivate an elite. It tends to be much more comfortable with the claim that what the college does is to develop, quote, leaders, unquote. But what else is a leader other than someone of superlative ability and accomplishment, and leaders as a group constituted by such persons? Dare I suggest that such a group might be considered to be the best in their respective endeavors, or in Greek, an aristoi, who together lead or govern as, of course, an aristocracy. Now, I think we shouldn't recoil from this thought. While the specifics of any particular elite may exhibit much to be condemned, such an elite's very existence is neither damnable nor really, quite frankly, preventable. Not simply difference, but inequality is written into the fabric of human nature and human society. What we should care about, therefore, I contend, is not whether we have an elite or not, we shall have one, but rather that elite's quality. Thomas Jefferson offers, in my view at least, a very fruitful way of thinking about the existence and role of a social elite. In his famous work, Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson advocated a system of education that would cultivate not only the population in general, but also an elite who would occupy the most prominent positions in society. If you know Notes on the State of Virginia, this will all be, of course, familiar to you. Jefferson recommended in that work free universal education at an elementary level in every locale throughout the state, to be complemented by a winnowing process in which the student, in Jefferson's words, quote, of the best genius in the school, would be promoted on at public expense to grammar schools. After that, another winnowing process would take place at the grammar school where only the best students, therefore, would be continued on, again, at public cost. Certainly, if you were able to pay for this, you could stay. But this was a way, essentially, to cultivate the talents and discover them, quite frankly, of those who could not pay. At the end of grammar school, a final culling would take place, in which the most accomplished students would be sent on to positions at the state university, again on public scholarships. Jefferson summed up his vision by describing it thusly, and I quote, "The general objects of this law are to provide an education adapted to the years, to the capacity, and the condition of everyone, and directed to their freedom and happiness." But this isn't the only goal that Jefferson had for education. In fact, in his famous correspondence with his longtime political nemesis, John Adams, Jefferson likewise praised the role of what he referred to as the natural aristocracy. Jefferson, of course, distinguished what he called the natural aristocracy from what he called the artificial aristocracy. The artificial aristocracy, more sort of in the sense that we generally understand the term aristocracy, someone born to a position, rather than someone who has, we might say, earned that position. But the definition that Jefferson gave to what he called the natural aristocracy was not simply one of intelligence. It was not simply one of, as he says in Notes on the State of Virginia, one of genius. Instead, Jefferson asserts that the grounds of this natural aristocracy among men are, quote, virtue and talents. One would hope, therefore, that the liberal arts are a training not simply in talent and its cultivation, but likewise in virtue. The ancient meaning of the word liberal, from which liberal arts takes its name, partakes not simply of a breadth of knowledge, although it certainly does that, but also a generosity of spirit and a nobility of character. The liberal arts, thus, from its very origins, is a realm of knowledge and a mode of education befitting the free person, the person at liberty, if you will, one unconstrained by necessity, an education, one might say, proper to a true aristoi. Now, fears that American elites are lacking in virtue is as old as the Republic. I mentioned a moment ago the famous correspondence between Adams and Jefferson. Adams himself insisted that Jefferson's distinction between the artificial aristocracy on the one hand, the natural aristocracy on the other was, in his words, quote, not well-founded. Talent, in Adams' view, was too diverse to find a common definition. And virtue, in Adams' rather pessimistic view, and if you know anything about Adams' character, this won't be surprising to you at all, he thought virtue was destined to be corrupted as the artificial aristocracy falls into monarchy and despotism. In our own time, books are published every year lamenting the corruption of America's elite. In fact, you can't swing a dead sheepskin today without hitting a damning critique of meritocracy. And in fact, in just the last 18 months, these 8 titles have hit the shelves. You may be familiar with some of these, maybe even have read them. We have Daniel Markovitz's book, quote, that is titled The Meritocracy Trap: How America's Foundational Myth Feeds Inequality, Dismantles the Middle Class, and Devours the Elite. We have Michael Lind's book, The New Class War: Saving Democracy from the Managerial Elite. Joel Kotkin, The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, a Warning to the Global Middle Class. Anthony Carnival's The Merit Myth: How Our Colleges Favor the Rich and Divide America. Freddie DeBoer's The Cult of Smart: How Our Broken Education System Perpetuates Social Injustice. David Goodhart's Head, Hand, Heart: Why Intelligence is Over-Rewarded, Manual Workers Matter, and Caregivers Deserve More Respect. Michael Sandel's The Tyranny of Merit: What's Become of the Common Good. And finally, Peter Mandler's The Crisis of the Meritocracy: Britain's Transition to Mass Education Since the Second World War. These are all books that have just been produced in the last 18 months on essentially the same topic, a critique of the elite, a critique of our meritocrats. I think it's fair to say that America is positively swimming in condemnation of its leadership class. And it's not simply from one political perspective. We can find it from the left, we can find it from the right as well. These are the people who are supposed to be our best, our aristoi. The meritocratic system created after World War II was supposed to be an improvement upon what in Rudolph's terms was, of course, the gentleman's college, and the economic and political system over which those gentlemen ruled. But it seems instead that the social consensus on both sides of the political spectrum is that this great effort has been largely a failure. I think a good instance of this is happened in 2018. Ross Douthat, who, as you probably know, is a columnist at the New York Times, stirred up a minor controversy on this theme. In 2018, when George Herbert Walker Bush, the former president, died, Douthat published an opinion column, and the title of that column was, "We Miss the Wasps." It wasn't why we should, it wasn't we will, it was we do right now. We miss them. We miss the WASP, that is the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant gentlemen who earned their C's, or maybe they earned better grades than that, at Yale and went on to run the country's major corporations and governmental institutions, as, of course, George H.W. Bush himself had done. Because our contemporary meritocrats in contrast, and this is Douthit's words, quote, "rule us neither as wisely nor as well," unquote. Just to give you a kind of a brief synopsis, Douthit's argument essentially went like this. Our current elite, the elite of 2018, the elite of the recent period, if you will, is just as animated as any elite has ever been. By power seeking, it's just as exclusionary as the Wasps were, perhaps on different grounds, just as self-replicating within families. But according to Douthit, at least, the Wasps had something that our current meritocrats don't. And his claim was that they had virtue. That is, they had noblesse oblige. They had an ethic of personal service, an ethic of service, also an ethic of personal austerity, of self-discipline, and of a form of cosmopolitanism that didn't sort of descend into simply sort of the lack of rootedness. Being a world citizen, we might call the alternative. Douthit called this, in his words, quote, "an aristocratic spirit," unquote. So I think in Douthit's view, what the Wasps had that the meritocrats don't is virtue, which realizes itself in competence and effectiveness. And what that competence combined with virtue produces, in Douthit's view, is legitimacy and trust. Now, as you can imagine, Douthit's column was widely criticized. And it was widely criticized on the grounds I bet all of you can predict before I even tell you. Douthit's column was bigoted. It was racist. It was white supremacist. But most of the criticism of Douthit's argument back in 2018 at the death of George Herbert Walker Bush really sidestepped, I think, the explicit comparison that Douthit encouraged us to do, to engage in between this past and this current elite, and ultimately to engage in that very question of competence, effectiveness, legitimacy, trust. That was really at the heart of Douthit's argument. And instead, they simply favored a condemnation on Douthit on the grounds of social justice. By this time in my talk, I see I'm about 20 minutes in, it's probably appropriate for me to define my terms a little more clearly. By social justice, so-called, I mean two related things. First, an ideology, or perhaps we might say a religion. Some of you may know a recent book came out last year called Cynical Theories by a pair of academics, former academics, Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay. And they argue that social justice or postmodernism is characterized by what they call the postmodern knowledge principle and the postmodern power principle. The knowledge principle fundamentally is what can be known, and it is highly oriented towards subjectivism and relativism. The power principle essentially says that the only thing that really constitutes human society is power, and the exercise of that power by Group A over Groups B through whatever letter you might choose in the alphabet. And really there is nothing else in society except for power. So that's on the one hand sort of this, if you might say, free-floating ideology. But the second thing I mean by social justice is the ideology or faith, if you will, of the American elite. That is the system of values and dogmas that empowers what is quite frankly a younger, somewhat browner, but still mostly white governing class to both displace an older, whiter, but still somewhat brown elite and exercise power over the rest of society. And thus, therefore, what social justice is not just simply a free-floating ideology, but also an instrument of what I certainly will happily call class struggle, both within the confines of the elite as well as outside of it. Seeing social justice as a class ideology, I think, helps us to understand its power and how it marks a changing of the guard, as it were, from one era to another, one elite to another. In some ways, social justice is a reaction against meritocracy and against meritocracy's shortcomings. In reaction against an elite brimming with intelligence, but perhaps a questionable deployment of their talent, social justice weighs heavily on what it takes to be virtue. Or perhaps social justice adherents might prefer to call it moral clarity, while largely dispensing with talent as an elitist myth. So when I suggest that social justice is a class religion or a class faith, I don't do so lightly. I certainly don't mean it as some kind of veiled insult, the way that many secularist critics of social justice do use it, as simply a way to kind of tar social justice as dogmatic or blind faith or overly simplistic. Social justice, I contend, is as much a religion as Christianity or communism or the therapeutic. I'll get to that latter point. And being a class religion, or perhaps I should say a class-inflected religion, much as, say, Episcopalianism or Pentecostalism have their obvious class-inflected characteristics. As with any successful faith, social justice shows every sign of capturing the country's institutions of political and economic and social power, and thus of making itself an established faith. We can see this, I think, veiled in Fred Rudolph's three eras of higher education, and therefore his three colleges, if you will, from American history. From the foundations of the country in the colonial period all the way down to the late 19th century, America's colleges were Christian. Why? Because America's elite was a Protestant elite. Conservative Protestant morality was taught in the public schools, as well as obviously in the institutions of higher education. Conservative Protestant churches were central institutions of socialization. Conservative Protestant clergy played prominent roles in the moral life of the country. Nearly all public debate took place within the contours of conservative Protestant sensibilities. After the Civil War, the influence of this Protestant establishment began to wane. A new secular university model emerged, supported by the rising titans of industrial capitalism. The academy turned to research rather than character formation. New professions emerged, such as psychiatry and social work, which sometimes were under the sponsorship of Protestant seminaries, eager to draw upon the new prestige of science and academic training, but over time eventually displaced the clergy and began to rival them, as well as the institutions of the professional class began to rival churches and their ministers. Conservative Protestants by the early 20th century found themselves tagged as fundamentalists. The WASP gentleman was entering into his spotlight, constructing on his way both economic and political empires. His liberal Protestantism, as contrasted to the conservative Protestantism that came before, blurred into an immanent religion of humanity, interested less in righteousness and salvation and much more so in social responsibility and material progress. But this era, too, of course, fell into eclipse. After World War II, the meritocracy began to emerge. The number of students sitting for the SAT, for example, increased tenfold over the course of the 1950s. The civil rights movement and the women's movements of the 60s and 70s quite literally changed the face of America's elite. By the 1980s, diversity had become higher education's cultural project and its hoped-for source of legitimacy. But rather than tag the College of the Meritocrats as one defined by an act of consumption, this is Rudolph's term, of course, I think we can see that the deeper culture of what Rudolph called the consumer college, or what I've been calling the meritocracy, is therapeutic. It expresses the values of individual success, as well as the compensatory, and as well as being compensatory, of the psychological costs of this intense competition and striving that defines the meritocrat. The therapeutic is defined by its commitments to three core values: individuality, authenticity, and liberation. So let me speak to those just very briefly. Individuality is not exactly the same thing as individualism. It takes traditional American individualism, but it weds that individualism to a romantic sensibility of the self, as a unique and creative spirit whose reason for existence is its own expression. Authenticity, therefore, builds upon individuality as the public expression of each person's unique essence. To be authentic, one must neither lie about nor obscure one's inner life. Therefore, one must publicly proclaim it. Thank God for social media. Now we can all proclaim our individual inner lives to everyone. And therefore, the feelings and desires, imaginations, and experiences are to be announced to the world. The therapeutic self, if you will, is to be revealed. This inner life must be brought forward and outward, expressed, or one might even say, from a postmodern perspective, performed in words and deeds and confessions and self-revelations. Authenticity urges one ever onward to, quote, be yourself, and to, quote, speak your truth. Finally, liberation. Liberation is the wider social condition in which these authentic selves become socially recognized. Mental health professionals once counseled some decades ago the development of pro-social interdictions that would enable an individual's adaptation to social expectations. But under the therapeutic, what mental health professionals, at least the ones who are most prominent in their fields, now they advocate for the wholesale transformation of society so that society can facilitate the self-actualization of each individual. Social justice, I think, is very much an outgrowth of the therapeutic, but it is inflected through intersectionality to be the qualities rather of individuals and individual personalities, to be the qualities of identity groups, and of therefore, of course, the individuals who constitute those identity groups. I'm assuming we're all quite familiar, perhaps overly familiar, with the doctrine of intersectionality. So those identity categories of race and sex, color, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability status, etc., 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 they're really the building blocks from this perspective of society. That is, this is the social justice ontology, what really exists in the world. Each category, says social justice, has its own experience of the world, its own knowledge, if you will, and therefore its own way of knowing that exists within what we might call an inverted hierarchy, in which those who, it's claimed, suffer the most oppression are therefore the most knowledgeable, and those who suffer the least oppression, therefore, are in fact the least knowledgeable. This is the social justice epistemology, that is a way of knowing, which comes to social justice through post-structuralism, back to Antonio Gramsci, Marx, and really all the way back to Hegel and his master-slave dialectic. Thus, social justice shares with the therapeutic a sensibility of radical subjectivity in which what you and I might call the real world, beyond ourselves and shared with all others, does not exist, or at least does not exist in any meaningful sense. The claim, of course, is that everything that exists can only be known by human beings through language, and therefore the real world, if we can call it that, can never really be known outside of human language, and the construction, therefore, of the real world, so-called, by the exercise of power, all the way down, even unto the roots of our humanity, our material bodies, our rational souls. Thus, we come to social justice's political principle, a doctrine that asserts the human experience is a wholly immanent one of material, cultural, and psychological oppression and liberation. The utopia of social justice is the same as the utopia of the therapeutic: equal esteem and equal social recognition, which we now seem to be calling equity. One can see this, I think, clearly in the best-selling racialist book of the post-George Floyd era, Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. I assume many of you have heard of this, some of you may even have read it. This book relates the author's autobiographical journey of cultural and psychological struggle to shed judgment and embrace cultural relativism. The dream is equity through all the institutions of social order. This includes the state, of course, but it's not limited, importantly, to the state. And among other sites of power, the state really is hardly the most important of all. I think we saw this very clearly in the 4 years of the Donald Trump presidency. While social justice was marginalized in the state throughout those 4 years, it only grew stronger outside the state. And its return under the Biden administration is really but a capstone now to its conquest of every institution of elite power and authority in the country. The press, the professions, especially law and medicine, the culture industries, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, higher education. As the emphasis of this conference, of course, is higher education, let me say something briefly on the matter of the academy in particular. Social justice intends to do to higher education what Soviet communism did to fine art, literature, music. In the USSR, under officially approved socialist realism, art was judged first and foremost by how well it depicted Soviet ideals, how well it parroted Communist Party doctrine, and how well it cultivated loyalty to the Soviet system. Not even the physical sciences were exempted from serving a primarily ideological purpose during the 30-year reign of Lysenkoism over Soviet biology and agronomy. Substitute critical race theory for Marxism-Leninism. Substitute whiteness for capitalism. Substitute racial justice for dictatorship of the proletariat. And I think you'll understand much of what social justice offers us. This is the faith of our elites. Consider the mantra, diversity, equity, inclusion. It's become the operating faith of, not all certainly, as you well know, but almost all, of American higher education. You may be familiar with recent stories coming out of the most elite prep schools in the country, the Dalton School, or the United Nations International School in New York City, or the Brentwood School in Los Angeles, each of which, again, are the most elite prep schools in America with the price tags to prove it, and each has been completely overtaken by a particularly aggressive and destructive form of social justice. I'm sorry to say that, in my view, there's certainly very little use in crying out for liberty in response. Within American liberty, there's always been, and indeed there must be, definitions which prescribe certain behaviors and proscribe others. For example, Christian elites in their day banned obscenity, and for a brief period, even banned the consumption of alcohol. The gentlemen of their day put Eugene Debs in prison and defined homosexuality as a mental illness. The meritocrats, they enforced standardized testing and imposed globalization and deindustrialization on the American economy. Thus, when social justice elites today prescribe hate speech, when they redefine the word sex, when they set out to racialize all of American society, in one sense, they're doing what elites have always done. They're promulgating their own class culture and defining it as normative for the rest of society. So therefore, my contention here tonight is that we shouldn't lament the existence of an elite or the power of that elite to define social norms of the forest of custom and law. This is ubiquitous to human society. What we should do instead is lament the existence of this elite, this culture, this exercise of power. Recall Jefferson's view of the natural aristocracy. In his words, this was, quote, the most precious gift of nature for the instruction, the trusts, and government of society, unquote. For even in a democratic republic, the question of rulership is not obviated. The need for coordination to accomplish some good, combined with the frailty of mankind, indicates as much. Thus, a true aristoi should be both desired and cultivated, both in its talents and in its virtue, precisely so that the whole may benefit. How to do this? This is our great task, not simply for today, but always. Shall we work through national party politics? Shall we pursue an invigorated form of federalism? Shall we seek to separate the country into pillars, as was done after World War II in countries like the Netherlands and Belgium, where each community had its own institutions of media and sports clubs and schools and universities and hospitals and political parties? I take these to be practical questions that people of goodwill can certainly debate and differ on. What we should not differ on, however, is the cultivation of a counter-elite that knows and pursues the transcendentals of truth, beauty, and goodness. Being spiritual, these transcendentals are none the diminished for being shared, and in fact are only enhanced in their sharing. Thus, these are truly common to society. The dignity of every human being, the dissemination of knowledge, of the reality that exists beyond us, the cultivation of reason, the propagation and diffusion of beauty. The successes of the social justice faith, such as they are, point up the fact that mankind yearns for a collective project through which he can pass beyond the baseness of this world and into another. The meritocrats seemingly have satisfied none, not even themselves. Success for its own sake, accomplishment turned toward individual gain, virtue as a series of leadership opportunities completed, have not satisfied. Social justice adherents know as well as we do that mankind is made for something greater than what we see. Satisfying such a yearning with something that brings true happiness to mankind is the only thing that can answer it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Paul. We now have time for some Q&A. If you have a question, please make your way to one of the microphones.
If you don't talk, you're going to force me to talk for another 20 minutes, and you don't want that.
Thank you for speaking. You mentioned that you suggested this or put forward the idea that we need to raise up a new elite. What do you think of the idea of the grifters or like a deceptive elite or a tool used by the current elite to misdirect or misguide potentially new rising elite that could counter them, but misleading them by deception? You see a lot of this in, potentially in like Koch brothers founded organizations and things of that nature, where people are led into, rather than using the institutions as promoting virtue, but as promoting a kind of liberty that is more laissez-faire or promoting like freedom to do promote non-virtue and things of that nature. What do you think of that?
I mean, I think this is one of the great questions for, we might call it the right, conservatives, whatever it might be. What I think characterizes the American elite today is certainly a very left-wing attitude, shall we say, on cultural issues, but actually quite moderate to maybe even perhaps so-called conservative attitude towards economics, free trade, globalization, open borders, these sorts of things. So I think that the older system in which conservatives argue for the free market is not particularly threatening, and in fact can be incorporated in many ways into the kinds of elite thought that we have today. There are some differences. I don't want to downplay them completely, but I don't think it would constitute any kind of counter elite. And so certainly the aspects of globalization that we see is something that's quite amenable to what we take to be the left as well as to much of the right today. And this is where I think the Trump presidency was most distinct in terms of its foreign policy on trade, on immigration, on war. which I fear we're going to see quite a reversal under the Biden administration.
Thank you for coming and speaking today, Dr. Paul. My question is, you say that we need this counter-elite who pursue the true and the good and knowledge and things like that. But my question more is, do we even think that whether you raise up that good or not, it still has to, that elite, it still has to be somewhat popular to get into power and places of power? And do you think that it even can be popular even more? And if so, how?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a good question, and I think there are a couple of different ways to answer it. One is to obviously focus on institutions and to suggest that perhaps it is not popular at a national level, but it may be popular at local levels. And so there may be institutions at levels of state government, or there may be institutions in terms of particular kinds of professional institutions that might be able to be locations in which this new elite can form itself. And certainly when we see the experience of the social justice elite that we have now, that was not particularly popular at its time and may not even be that popular today. It's difficult to tell. But there is the occupation of positions of power and authority in institutions, and then the use of those positions of institutions to propagate views. And so I guess much of it comes down to the boundaries, if you will, of democracy. And if one takes the United States to have been a democratic republic for its entire history, I think we still have seen many kinds of elite projects that have not been particularly popular, but still have been instantiated because of elite power. And so therefore, I think popularity in and of itself is not necessarily an impediment to the cultivation of a counter-elite.
Thank you kindly for your time. As you yourself identified in your definition of terms, the precision of language is incredibly important, especially in this discussion within the public square. So my question is, in this rising of the new elite, how do you recommend that once the new elite themselves identifies and understands what certain terms mean, specifically terms like social justice and truth, as they're misused and misdefined on the alternate side, how should the new elite seek to permeate the culture with the correct definitions, if you will?
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is quite a difficult task, because if one is trying to counter definitions with alternative ones, the possibility, of course, is one begins speaking a different language, in essence. And so I saw something similar. So 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, there was a social justice flare-up, shall we say, at my institution. And much of the dispute was around the definition of words like violence. And I found that it was extremely difficult to talk to people about what violence is. But I think at the same time it's essential, because much of, I think, social justice ideology uses terms that have particular kinds of meanings, and people don't question those meanings, and so therefore are willing to, shall we say, give the benefit of the doubt to people whose usage of language should not have the benefit of the doubt. Some, the most hardcore, are not going to be persuaded. They are not persuadable. But I think there is, at least my experience certainly suggests, a much larger middle group that is either persuadable or certainly reachable, and can be talked to and with on these topics, because I think they are worried, they are concerned by the power of the social justice ideology. But there are such pressures upon people to conform, and I'm not sure how it is here at Hillsdale College, but certainly at Williams College, it's a similar place, rather small, liberal arts college, very remote, kind of in the middle of nowhere. There's a tremendous amount of social pressure to conform, because you want to have friends and you want to be well thought of. And so it takes some degree of courage, I think, and so that would be a piece of advice that I would give as well, to have courage.
Thank you for your talk. This is sort of similar to that question, but on a slightly different note. How do you think that the increased use of social media to propagate some of these ideas has impacted the rise of the new elite? And is it worth it at all to engage on that platform to help with bringing people to understanding, more correct definitions about things like social justice?
Mm-hmm. So I've seen data that suggests that when it comes at least to political topics, social media is pretty heavily weighted on the left. For whatever reasons we could speculate on, I'm sure there's probably research on this as well, there tends to be a more kind of left orientation on social media. My sense is that social media is a platform built for emotional outbursts and diatribes, and so therefore it doesn't lend particularly well to, we might say, reasoned argument. But what it can do also is be a medium of symbols and symbolism. So rather than engaging people in argument, I think what might be better is to, well, you guys are far better at this than I, share memes, use humor, mock. One thing that people who are deadly, deadly serious, as most social justice people are, they tend not to have a very well-developed sense of humor, is to make fun of them because it is something they absolutely cannot bear. And so I'm guessing you know of places, websites like the Babylon Bee, which is very good. Sometimes their articles don't live up to the headlines, but by God, those headlines are 90% of the time absolutely hilarious. Those kinds of things I think can actually be probably more productive than trying to take the high ground and engage in reasoned debate.
Hi, thank you so much for your time. I was just wondering, since social justice says that the unoppressed can never fully learn or know what it means to be oppressed, do you think that inserting social justice into the education system kind of promotes an attitude of deserved ignorance in a way, and that it actually stunts people from reaching across the aisle and learning about cultures and experiences, and basically that it's a social justice, do you think it's a self-defeating concept?
Mm-hmm. I guess in part it depends on what we think the goal of social justice is. If we think it is a more integrated society, one that is characterized by kind of a flourishing of understanding and sharing across groups, then I think that's very much not what it's accomplishing. Certainly, it seems to be doing exactly the opposite. That being said, I'm personally not convinced that that's its goal. I think its goal is much more the exercise of power and to transform the current elite and to provide places for they themselves to occupy. When we look at the incident in the New York Times, for example, in the spring around the whole Tom Cotton editorial, where the name escapes me, but the editor of the Times was essentially fired over that. It was a way to open up space and allow new people to come in and take positions of power and authority. If we think that that's the fundamental goal, then we shouldn't be surprised that it's not lending to the kinds of conversations, if you will, that it claims to want to have. One of the things that I think is the most certainly depressing, and maybe if I was in a particularly pessimistic mood, dangerous aspects of social justice is its racialism. That is, that there is really no human experience. And I think the speaker at 4 o'clock today spoke very eloquently on so many of these aspects of the human experience. And social justice tends to eliminate those kinds of conversations. My hope, certainly, is that by engaging in those conversations, one can find, probably not very hard, in not a very difficult way, that kind of common humanity. Because that is what I would hope that we would all want to gather around. Certainly some kind of intercultural sharing and understanding, but underneath that common human experience.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, thank you for speaking today. I'm curious, we've been talking both about public opinion and then also about the kind of character of the elite classes. And I'm kind of curious about which one do you think is more important, or like which follows from the other? Like, does the character of the elite, affect public opinion, or does like public opinion and common perceptions affect the character of the elite?
I'm sad to say that the social science research seems to suggest that it's elite opinion creates public opinion. In fact, a friend of mine in my department showed me some research within the last 5 years or so that seems to have pretty good empirical support that people look to those who they take to be their leaders. They don't have opinions on subjects, but they look to those leaders to have those opinions. And so it is, for the most part, the elites that craft the opinions that the public has. Not fully, not completely. I don't want to go down too much of a kind of a Thorsten Veblen sociology in which the kind of cultural values of the top just kind of flow down and are forced down upon the lowers, or of a Pierre Bourdieu or someone like that. I think there is some dimension of autonomy among middle classes and working classes. But those autonomous views, opinions, values are very difficult to express politically. And so this is why I think the project of elites is one that we cannot avoid, and one that's desperately important to engage in, and not to simply give up and say, well, those are the people that run, the American Medical Association and the American Legal Association and much of higher education, and nothing we can do about it, but at least here, we can have, whatever we want to believe in my church or in my neighborhood or whatever it is. Because those smaller, more local kinds of spaces are not going to be left alone. I think we can see that already in just the first couple of weeks of the Biden administration. And so the project of forming an elite is an unavoidable one, and one that a place like Hillsdale, I take, embraces.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Paul.